make me seem more extroverted. I'm very comfortable in social situations, but I don't prefer them to hanging out with my dogs, for example. So there's so much to say about personality, but I don't want this video to be super long, so I'm going to focus on the agreeableness dimension and just talk a little bit about how differences in agreeableness can lead to all kinds of conflict. So when you have an agreeable person, a fundamentally agreeable person is a very trusting person, a very cooperative person, a person who's willing to take a less fair deal than what might be coming to them in the interests of the harmony of the relationship and just keeping everybody happy. We often refer to these people in psychodynamic therapy as codependent, so-called codependent, when really all codependence is a very conscientious person and a very agreeable person in the same personality. So if you have those two characteristics, again, I know of what I speak, I have them both in spades, that makes you what we would call codependent. So you are trying to do the right thing, and you're trying to clean up other people's messes, and you're trying to kind of keep everything steady, and you're doing it at some detriment to yourself if you're not careful. So the danger for agreeable people is that they will find themselves being exploited by less agreeable people. And so they must guard against this, because if they don't, they will perpetually find themselves in relationships where they are unable to pursue the goals and happiness that they might have for themselves because they're too busy meeting those needs and goals of other people. So the main piece of advice for agreeable people, especially considerably agreeable people, is to keep your distance from disagreeable people. We call this in esteem dynamics, Dr. Lyle and I call this the disagreeable distance. This is literally you are minimizing your contact with disagreeable people, and you don't need to think very hard about who the disagreeable people in your life are. You certainly already know who they are. They're people you probably don't enjoy spending very much time with anyway, but you feel some kind of obligation to them. Sometimes they're in your own family. Sometimes you work with them and you feel like you're sort of stuck putting up with them. But there are always ways that we can minimize our contact. So that's really the first major piece of advice for agreeable people who are in the situation, is to start realizing that essentially what you have is some distortion in your personality. Because you are more agreeable than average, you are essentially going through life with a key distortion about how you see the world, and you are more likely to make choices based on that distortion than you would if you had perfect information. So we are all distorted somewhere on the bell curves. In principle, somebody is out there who is completely down the middle on each of them. I have not met that person. I just haven't met enough people to make that statistically possible. They are out there in principle, but most people are somewhat or significantly distorted on one or more personality dimensions, and this is just how it is. And once we understand how fixed personality is, we're able to take people as they are and not take their personalities personally. No pseudo bad pun intended there. And we also are able to view ourselves and interactions with other people with a little more compassion, because we understand what kind of distortion we are bringing to the situation. So as much as I would want to stand up for myself and be more disagreeable when I'm being exploited, that's not who I am. I'm never going to be that person. But I can learn to be more situationally disagreeable when I practice certain scripts and when I role play certain situations and I anticipate them and I prepare for them. But I'm never going to be somebody who is reactively disagreeable when I'm being pushed by a disagreeable person. I'm always going to I'm going to be more of I'm going to choose flight over fight, essentially. And that is just because of how I am wired and how I see the world. When you can imagine there are lots of people that we would run into who are going to choose fight every time because they're just more disagreeable. The other big piece of advice that we have for agreeable people who might be suffering dealing with disagreeable people is what Dr. Lyle coined this term called the mathematization of misery. So all this is if you are stuck in a situation with disagreeable coworkers, disagreeable family, some sort of dynamic that it's tough to get out of in the short term, what you need to be doing is essentially making an exit plan. So if it is work, we need to be looking for a way to either completely minimize your contact with that person or to find another job. And if it's with family, Hopefully it's not immediate family that you live with. If that's the case, then we have sort of other problems and we can talk about that. But if it's more commonly, it's sort of distant family that you see at holidays or a few times a year. In cases like this, or if you're at a conference where you're dealing with your blowhard coworker who's going to have a few too many drinks and is just going to make your life miserable for a weekend, what we do is we mathematize the misery. So we literally sit down and we figure out how many hours do I have to be in proximity with this person. And you can do this in different ways for however it's best for your particular nervous system, but you can even write it down on like a little index card with squares for every hour and check those hours off as they go by. And then you're able to view this is a constrained situation. It's not going to last forever. It's a limited amount of time, and once you do it, you're going to have it over with for the next year, and you're not going to see these people until the next holiday season. So this makes it just much more manageable, and it makes it more tolerable to get through when you know that it's time limited and that there is a light at the end of the tunnel that is not an oncoming train. With disagreeable people, just like with any other inherent personality conflict, it's all about understanding who you are and accepting who you are. Basically, you want to start thinking about yourself as a very particular kind of plant with very particular requirements in order to thrive. So we are all little individual hothouse flowers that require very different conditions that are optimal for our very particular personalities and our nervous systems. And just because something works really well for somebody in our immediate family or somebody that we're in a relationship with does not mean that it's exactly the same kind of circumstance that is optimal for our happiness and our well-being. So the whole game is about it's a process of self-discovery to really understand who you are at the essence of who you are, and to remember that this is really genetically fixed and that there's nothing wrong with you for being distorted on any of these dimensions. Maybe you are a disagreeable person, and there are plenty of disagreeable people out there. There's nothing wrong with being disagreeable. That is not an inherently bad thing to be. Robert Plomin, who's a behavioral geneticist who recently wrote a wonderful book called Blueprint, calls this, the phrase that he uses to describe this is that the abnormal is normal. That because everything is on a bell curve, everything falls on these beautiful continua, that there's nothing abnormal about being on the extreme of any bell curve because it is a bell curve. There's nowhere that we can draw that line and say, this side of this line is normal, this side is not, because it's just by definition going to be arbitrary. And also by definition, because these are characteristics that fall on bell curves, there will always be extremes at the tail end. So this is just what we're dealing with. We are dealing with a wide distribution of characteristics in the human population as far as personality goes, and your job as an individual is to figure out who you are and where you thrive. So we need to be just as kind to ourselves as we would be to the flowers in our home. Some flowers prefer a lot of sunlight, some prefer acidic soil, some do not do well with those things at all and like it a little more shady and a little less acidic. This is what we need to do for ourselves. It requires some discernment, some self-discovery, and some courage to act on our immediate environment, because sometimes that means that we won't be spending as much time with the people that we think that we need to spend time with out of some kind of distorted sense of obligation that's coming out of the extremes in our own personalities. So that's that for today.